Welcome to Bent Not Broken, where we empower and motivate women by sharing real-life stories of adversity and provide expert advice on how to overcome those obstacles and help you live your best life. Now here's your host, Juanita Kelly.
Hello, friends. Well, welcome to episode 9 of Bent Not Broken. I'm your host, Juanita Kelly. We all handle stressful situations differently. Of course, we're all different people. We have different emotions. We handle those emotions differently, and we express them differently. If faced with your own mortality or the mortality of someone that you love, what would you do? When I found out that my grandmother had stage 4 cancer, I spent most of those early weeks trying to block every fear-filled emotion from my mind, and I focused on her surviving and beating cancer. Even with the reality of how serious her prognosis was, I still held out hope that somehow a miracle was going to happen. I am always amazed by the strength of those who've been diagnosed with life-threatening illnesses. For instance, when my grandmother was diagnosed, she didn't tell anyone for weeks. I wonder how she kept that to herself. How awful must that have been to keep all those fears and emotions and thoughts to herself? What happens to someone when they're diagnosed with a life-threatening illness? Where do they find the strength to be strong, just to get up in the morning and not be depressed, to be happy in the face of death? How do they keep other people motivated? On today's episode, we'll be talking about coming face to face with your own mortality with author and speaker Lyn Delmastro Thompson. Today's episode is entitled, A Cancer Diagnosis Changed Me. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to Bent Not Broken podcast. I have the pleasure today of having Lyn Delmastro Thompson. She has a really interesting story. Lyn is a mind-body medicine practitioner. She uses the healing systems of the Bodytalk and Body Intuitive. She's also a speaker and an author of Amazon bestseller entitled, You Are Not Your Diagnosis, which that's just amazing. Welcome, Lyn.
Hi there. I'm excited to be here.
We're so thrilled to have you. You have a really distinctive story. And at the age of 25, you were misdiagnosed with leukemia.
Yes.
Wow. Let's go back to 2004 when you went to the doctor and you got this misdiagnosis. Explain to us what happened.
Well, I actually was scheduled for elective surgery that year in the summer of 2004, and not for, anything related to something that I would have thought, leukemia would have come up. I was scheduled for a breast reduction surgery. And as they always do, they do pre-op blood work. And I had gone through all of the process, they even did the marking up, and, I was already nervous for the next day. And I get a phone call the night before the surgery from the surgeon. And I'm kind of like, okay, this isn't normal. And he says, your pre-op blood work came back and there's something that doesn't look quite right in it. And, he said, don't panic quite yet. Sometimes lab errors happen. So can you just run back over to the hospital tonight and have them run the labs again? So he said not to panic, but of course I'm starting to panic. Mm-hmm. I drive over, we have the labs run again, and I get a phone call probably an hour or two later from the surgeon. And he says, yeah, it's not a lab error, Lyn. It's something is wrong and I can't do surgery.
Oh my goodness.
And that was all I was left with that night, really, was just, I can't do surgery. You need to see your primary doctor. And, that's like a whole big can of worms that was just opened up. And I'm like, what's wrong with my blood work? Why can't I have surgery? And that was, all he told me was just, we can't do surgery.
The level of anxiety you must have experienced that night. How did you even sleep?
I don't think I slept very well that night for sure. It was one of those nights of just kind of waiting. And, I think I called first thing the next morning to my primary doctor and was like, this is what happened. Can you get me in soon? And I think they got me in that day, ran more tests, still not being given a whole lot of information about what's going on. And the next thing I know, I think it was either that day or the next day, I get a phone call from a doctor who I'd never heard of before. And he said, "How are you doing?" And I'm like, "Well, other than freaking out because I don't know who you are and why you're calling me."
Exactly.
Again, this is not normal for a doctor to just call who we don't know. "I'm okay." And he said, "Well, if you don't have any symptoms tonight, you can stay home and you can come meet me tomorrow at the hospital." And I was still again like, what symptoms are we talking about here? But I don't think I even asked. I was just so shocked. Okay, what am I supposed to be worried about?
So at this moment, you weren't experiencing anything out of the normal. You didn't feel strange at all.
Not other than just, emotional symptoms.
The nervousness, yes.
Right. The anxiety, the like, what the heck is happening to my life right now?
Okay.
And so, I was fine that night, other than, again, I don't think I hardly slept. And I was constantly wondering what symptoms I was supposed to be looking out for. And I go to the hospital the next day and he meets me there. And then I start to get a little bit of a picture of something. He said, "We think that there's something going on with your liver and that maybe you're developing a blood clot in the veins that drain the liver." And I'm like, what? What's going on? And that started just cascading into another specialist, a hematologist, coming in to try and figure out why that was going on. And then them trying to figure out, well, if you've closed off your veins from your liver, this is bad. We need to get them back opened up. And they sent me to a different hospital because I was just in a smaller town in California where they'd never dealt with somebody who had had this particular issue of clotting off the veins that drain the liver. And I went to that hospital. I was there for probably about 10 days and more tests. Just anybody who's been through the medical system knows that there's a lot of poking and prodding and testing and waiting. And finally, then one of the person who was the head of my team at that time came in and he finally had a diagnosis for me. And that diagnosis was chronic myelogenous leukemia.
Oh my goodness. How did you tell your friends and your family?
A lot of people that were really close to me kind of knew something was going on because, people started to hear that I was in the hospital. We were going through this whole process, but, having to break the news of, the word leukemia it was really hard. I was scared to say it out loud. I was scared, what were people going to start to see me as? Because that was one thing that I've always kind of thought, when somebody has cancer, they can often become kind of like, oh, they're the cancer patient. And I really didn't want everybody to just all of a sudden stop seeing me for who I was and start seeing me as, the young woman with leukemia.
So at this time, you are a grad student, is that correct?
Yes, I was in grad school.
You're going through all of these emotions and it's up and down. It's a roller coaster.
Yes, that's a perfect description for it. It was a roller coaster.
So the doctor, he finally tells you that you have this illness that is life-threatening. What did you do over that next year?
That year was just, I felt like I was trying to first find some sort of equilibrium. It's like, everything felt like it went from being, life before the diagnosis to life after, and trying to navigate, what does that really feel like? How do I identify myself, in life? What do I want to do with my life at this point? That started to become more and more of a question for me, because up until that point, I had actually been in this program that I was in for about 3 years. And I was actually very unhappy in those 3 years. And so I started to kind of have more questions about, is this really making me happy? Is this the direction I want my life to go in? And then something happened in the following year that was just sort of the second catalyst to completely changing my life. And that was actually my best friend who I had met in college. She passed away extremely suddenly after just having she had her tonsils removed of all things. And she died after that. She had a blood clot, which struck so close to home for me as somebody who had also had a blood clot. And it shook my whole world. It caused me to question everything. And I think that was when it really, really felt real that, hey, people in their mid-20s can just die. Like I could be next.
So the reality of everything just kind of came down on you. You were facing your own mortality and you just had your close friend pass away from a simple procedure.
Yes.
Wow.
So that was kind of, if the diagnosis was sort of the shakeup, that was kind of like the nuclear bomb that was just like
exploded. Yeah.
Yeah.
So your emotions were all over the place, I can imagine. And you were dealing with a lot, you had to process a lot of information.
Yes.
How did you maintain? How did you, if it were me, I would have been like, you know what? I'm not getting out of bed. Like, that's it. How did you motivate yourself?
Well, speaking of not getting out of bed, I did that for a little bit after my friend died. I went to a pretty dark emotional place and I spent a lot of time laying in bed, not really taking very good care of myself because I just was so depressed.
Yes.
I sunk for probably about 2 months in that, just kind of spiraling down, not really eating regularly. I would kind of forget to take my medication some of the time. And my parents just started getting more and more worried because they could see, they lived far away, but they could tell I was just spiraling into this dark place where I think I was sort of, in a sense, suicidal, but more like suicidal by I'm just going to let myself die instead of I'm going to actively kill myself. I'm just not going to take care of myself.
You just kind of gave up.
I gave up. I felt like everything that I had worked for to that point was just up in the air. The one person that I felt closest to that was like a sister to me was gone. And I was, what am I supposed to do now? I don't really know.
Mm-hmm. So what did you do next?
Well, my parents took some time to kind of convince me that I needed help. And finally, I was stubborn for a while. And I finally admitted that I needed help. And I went into an inpatient mental health program for about 5 days. It didn't really take all that long. I just kind of needed that ability to reset and to get some support. I remember kind of in one of the sessions with the psychologist or psychiatrist, I don't remember what her credentials were. I had this light bulb moment of, I don't really want to die. I just don't know how to process all of this stuff that was just dumped onto me. And my life is just completely, taken apart. And now what do I do? And I turned around from there. It was like, okay, that is what I need help with. I need help to figure out how do I start to move through it.
So now you're in this therapeutic situation and you have the opportunity to really kind of look at yourself and you understood why you were feeling what you were feeling and you could put everything into the place that it belonged. And after you did that, you came out of this therapeutic situation and what happened?
I started I was getting outpatient therapy quite regularly. And then I started to actually get really curious about other ways that I could start to help myself. I think that was where I kind of catalyzed into a healing mode instead of just trying to survive. And I started going back to biofeedback, which was something that I had experienced when I was a teenager and I got really bad migraines. And so I used that to help with the anxiety and to help to reconnect with my body. I think that was the other thing that I really gained from that was a different relationship with my body. And then my therapist said, well, there's this class that's called Yoga for Healing. And I'm like, what? Yoga, that's not at a gym, the only experience I'd ever seen was, going to a gym and watching people, in the other room do yoga. And I was like, you do know I'm sick, right? You're sending me to yoga?
You want me to go yoga?
Yeah. And she's like, no, Lynn, this is different. I really want you to trust me. Go check out this class. This teacher is amazing. And I was like, okay, reluctantly, I'm going to do it. And I fell in love instantly. It was just, this is so different.
So tell me, what is it about yoga that gave you this different spark?
It was the way kind of we were allowed to just be on the floor. It was a class that used a lot of restorative poses. So using props to just support your body and just kind of being on the floor and breathing and just kind of feeling held and supported, both by the bolsters and the props and all of those things. And also just in the container that this teacher who I still love. And I actually have kind of started seeing some of her online classes now, again, years later, just being held in that container where there was kind of this potential for healing and just seeing my body in a different way.
With the help of yoga, you started to look at yourself differently and your healing process began. That's just wonderful.
Yes, it was such a beautiful part of the journey to kind of be like, oh, my body is actually not really the enemy. I started to just befriend my body again, like, oh, you've tried as hard as you can. And then I think in that process, both in therapy and in that, I started to realize that I had been really neglecting my body or tuning out what it was trying to tell me for a really long time.
Well, that's interesting you say that. That leads me to ask you this question. You speak about listening to yourself and listening to your body. What signs should we be paying attention to that our body's telling us and that we're totally, completely ignoring?
Any kind of sensation and symptoms are communication from our bodies. So, that can be a positive thing, right? Like when we have an amazing moment and we feel goosebumps and our body feels great, that's a beautiful communication that we're in a great space and there's alignment and joy and all of those wonderful things. And when we have things like pain or discomfort or just anything that a lot of us kind of want to brush past or make go away, that is also communication from our body. And we've gotten so used to it. I was looking up a statistic, I think it was last year or the year before, how many people reach for an over-the-counter medication when they have a symptom. And it was just mind-blowing to me that we've been so conditioned that that's one of our first responses is, oh, I have a headache, let me go get an aspirin or a Tylenol or whatever you take, instead of, I wonder why I have a headache. Could it be I'm dehydrated, I'm tired, I'm really angry and I'm not dealing with it, whatever it is, there's a reason for the headache.
So now you're here, you're dealing with the diagnosis of leukemia, and you've begun the practice of yoga. Tell me what happened when you found out that you were misdiagnosed.
So it was about 3 years after the initial diagnosis. And during those 3 years, I had actually been kind of struggling to find a different hematologist than the one I was seeing. I kind of had this gut feeling that he wasn't really the greatest doctor. He definitely didn't listen. He would spend all of 5 minutes with me. And one of the biggest things that stood out in my memory was when he would ask me, how are you feeling? And I would always answer, like, I don't feel well. I felt like I still was really struggling with a lot of things health-wise. He would say to me, you look great. See you next month.
Oh my goodness. What?
He would say that. And the kicker is, it was around that time that I had actually started just losing a dramatic amount of weight, like an unhealthy amount of weight. And people, friends would come up to me and even people that I hardly knew, and they would say, don't lose any more weight. You don't look healthy. And I'm like, how is this doctor just saying to me when I say I don't feel well, you look great? I'm like, no, I look like a human skeleton. Let's just call it what it is. All he looked at were these lab tests, and these lab tests were looking for something that actually was never there in the first place. So it looked like the medication was working, because he was just had these blinders on. And so I kept trying to get a different hematologist. And, most of us are familiar with, you need a referral to a specialist type of a system. And my primary doctor had gone to medical school with this guy. And he was like, oh, he's such a good doctor. We went to school together. And I'm like, he's really not that great, but okay. And I couldn't get him to give me another name. So it was only when I really took that leap in 2007 and I kind of extricated myself from my grad program. I got a job with health insurance because that was a key piece of the puzzle, was I needed health insurance. And I got a new doctor and a new primary doctor who then gave me a different hematologist's name that we found out in that very first appointment that hematologist questioned the diagnosis that I'd been given from, all the medical records I brought in. He started looking through them and he goes, I don't think this is CML.
Wow. What were you thinking when he said that to you?
So many different things. I was relieved that someone finally was listening to me because I had that kind of internal sense of something's off here. And I was angry because I had spent 3 years trying to get people to listen to me and trying to get a second opinion. And I wasn't really getting that until I changed my circumstances and could actually get a different doctor, and just relieved that this could mean something different, that I could maybe start to feel. I was feeling some better from all of the other things I was doing, but there was still something going on in my body that had been kind of left unaddressed.
And that was?
Well, the correct diagnosis was a different type of blood disorder. So it was something called polycythemia vera, which probably very few people have ever heard of. I had never heard of it before. Mm-hmm. And that's just a particular diagnosis where all of the different cell lines in the blood, the white cells, the red cells, and the platelets overproduce. So my body just keeps making more and more of those instead of saying, oh, we've got enough of these things. So that all made sense that, oh, here I have a clotting problem because my blood is really thick.
Thick, yes. Wow, I can't believe that you went through so much, 3 years of so much trauma.
Yes.
So much sadness, not knowing how long you're going to live, not knowing if you're going to die, having to deal with mental health issues as well. Right. And finally to get the real diagnosis.
Yes.
How relieved were you?
I was pretty relieved, in that first appointment, it wasn't confirmed. He said, I need to do some tests. I think it's probably this, but it was just like, that was a relief just to be heard, first of all. And then, once the tests were done and to hear it wasn't CML and that it was this other blood disorder, it was like, oh, well, A, this is why I'm not feeling better because this issue's just not been treated. And, B, this diagnosis sounds a little bit less scary than the leukemia diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. So now you have the proper diagnosis. How did you start looking at Bodytalk?
So Bodytalk actually didn't enter my life until maybe 7 years ago. So around maybe 2012. Okay. And I was already kind of in the holistic health field, kind of doing some of these other things that had helped me. And one day I woke up and I had this pain in my left knee. And I was like, okay, what the heck? This is really weird. I didn't bump into anything. I didn't fall down. Like I was thinking of all the things, the mechanical reasons my knee would hurt. And I was like, nope. Okay. Gave it a couple days. Was like, this is just still here. And I started using all of the holistic things that were in my toolbox at that time. I was going to my chiropractor. I started getting acupuncture done on it. I was studying yoga therapy at the time. So I was starting to do kind of therapeutic movements on it. And it was like, this pain does not want to get any better. Okay, this is really interesting. And it went on that way for about 3 months. And I was getting frustrated and I kept having this kind of intuitive sense. I think my knee is like talking to me, but it might as well be speaking Japanese for all I understand of what it's saying. And I remember at that time, remembering this woman I had met a year before when I was networking for my business. And she had told me she did something called Bodytalk. Oh, that sounds interesting. She told me a little bit about it. And at that time I was like, yeah, but I have, 15 other things that I already do. I probably don't need one more thing. And because I had this sense of my knee was talking, but I didn't know what it was saying, I thought maybe she could help me translate just from the name and what she had described. So I booked in a session, and in that session, she says to me, well, did something traumatic happen right before this pain? And I was like, oh yeah. And it was this total light bulb moment because this connection was not made in my brain whatsoever before. Right before this had happened, my parents had come from Idaho and I was living in Oregon at the time. My dad was going through a mental health crisis of his own at that point, and they were seeking a second opinion. They were trying to get him stabilized. And so they stayed with me for a couple of weeks. It was a very stressful couple of weeks. And then, they left, they went home, and I had taken 2 weeks off of being in my business, being self-employed. Mm-hmm. And then I was like, oh, well, I better get back to work. I got to start making some money again. And my body had just been basically putting that pain in the knee to make me realize you didn't even take 2 seconds to process what happened before you just jump back into.
Oh, wow. Yes.
doing life. And, it was traumatic what had happened. At one point, my dad actually, I was driving the car and he tried to open the door. And I think he was just like agitated and confused, but that was a very scary moment. And in the session with her, she helped me through using a technique to process the trauma that had happened in those couple weeks. And as soon as I got off the table, my knee did not hurt anymore. And I was like,
wow.
Whoa,
that's amazing.
How did that happen? Yeah, especially after like 3 months of trying everything, and it would get like small increments better, and then it would kind of get worse again, small increments better. And it was just completely gone, and it didn't come back. It was just gone.
That's amazing how the body can hold an injury, a pain, and tell you that it's holding it here, and you just needed to recognize it.
Exactly. Recognize it and address, what it represented, what its story was. That's kind of part of what Bodytalk is about. It's about the story behind the symptom. So that was the story behind that symptom. We saw the story, we addressed the story, and then it was like, okay, now I can go away now.
Wow. Just by acknowledging the story, your pain was alleviated.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes. It's so amazing. And I see that time and time again with clients where it's like, they have an experience of pain in an area and then we hear the story and then they're like, oh, it's gone now.
So let me ask you, your book, what actually motivated you and inspired you to sit down and write the book?
I felt like, well, as you said, I have quite the story to share. And I feel like a lot of people going through a journey with chronic illness that, it's such a challenging thing and it leaves us feeling so alone. And I really wanted to share what I had learned through my own journey and, through the years of study of different modalities and kind of the conclusions that I had come to about what it really takes to heal and how we can ultimately not be our diagnosis, how that's not our identity.
What are some simple strategies that we can start implementing in our daily lives to help us make some life-changing courses for the better?
I think the first thing that always comes to my mind is just developing a relationship with your body and like making time to try and connect with it, to try and hear what it's trying to tell you. So the first thing I always like to just tell people is you can start to try and figure out what do symptoms mean just by asking your body like, hey, so, why am I having this pain here? Or why is my stomach upset? And just start to kind of listen for what information might pop up. Some people might see an image. Some people might just have a sense of something. You might just hear a word in your head, so we can all start to tune into it. It's very intuitive when we start to learn how to listen to our bodies.
What's maybe one of your top tips for our listeners who want to start prioritizing their personal health?
I think the reminder that always comes to me is to just start someplace and start small. So I think we all think, there's 20 things that I should do that would make me feel better. I got to exercise more and drink more water and, change my diet. And then we get into overload and we don't do anything because 20 things is really hard to do all of that at once. So it's like, just pick one thing that really feels like it's doable and take a baby step. And it's like, oh, well, I'm just going to start drinking more water every day. Great. Set yourself a small goal and start doing that every day. And then once you get that down, pick another thing to start to do and add that into your routine.
Yes, wise words. You start off small and gradually work your way up into something larger. Yes, that's great. You shared some tremendous insights today. Your story is just amazing. And let me tell you, I'm so thankful that you got the misdiagnosis and that you don't have leukemia and that your illness is under control. And that
I'm so thankful too.
And you turned all of this into such a positive, and you're out here helping other women and men change their lives and understand that they're not their diagnosis. That's wonderful. How can our listeners find you online?
So my website is heartfirehealingllc.com.
And are you on any social media channels?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and it's just under my business name, Heartfire Healing.
Well, Lynn, it was great talking to you today. I really enjoyed, and good luck with everything.
On the next episode of Bent Not Broken, we talk with author and speaker Simone Nigo as we discuss living your best life. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.
This has been Bent Not Broken with Juanita Kelly. Thanks for listening. You can find us online at www.bentnotbroken.co, all major podcast platforms and YouTube. Be sure to follow us on social media at Bent Not Broken Podcast.